I think the toughest thing for me dealing with the AIDS crisis was, of course, the grief and the loss of so many people. I remember in 1995, I quit counting, and at that time I had lost 500 people. And that hurt deeply. In order to get through the mass number of people I was losing, I had to delay my grief. And that's not something you can do easily. So you had to find mechanisms to do that. Dance, and I'm a lousy dancer. Go to a memorial, then go to the club and dance. Don't talk to anybody, don't do anything, just keep dancing. Just hear the music, shut everything else out. Shut out what happened that day, shut out what's gonna happen tomorrow. Just dance. Dance until your legs give out. So dance was a powerful force for a lot of us in the community. We couldn't give up on life. We had to reassure ourselves that we were still living. The end of 1987, I learned that my best friend of 22 years, who had moved from Birmingham and was now living in Denver, had AIDS. And he came to visit in March. And we had a long discussion. And he kept saying, let me talk to you about what I'm going through and what it's like to have AIDS. And all I knew was if he had AIDS, he was going to die. And I wasn't ready to talk about that. And I kept changing the subject. We're not going to talk about this. And yes, we are. Well, being the crazy idiot he was fun. He cuts the car off in the middle of the interstate where all of them merge, took the key out and said, I'm not moving this car until you agree to talk to me. And cars were honking at us, blowing horns, flipping us off, anything you can imagine. I said, okay, pull over. And we talked for about an hour. And he told me stories at the time I found hard to believe about people being kicked out of their homes and by their parents, losing their jobs, losing their housing. And I had not heard that part of the epidemic yet. But he said he was fortunate that he had a strong support network of friends in Denver, and he was going to stay there. But then he said, I know you want to be there for me, and you can be there for me if you promise me something. And I said, what's that? He said, promise me that you'll be there for at least one person living with AIDS that has no one. And I made that promise not knowing how in the world I would keep it. And then he died the following January. Later in the year, I went to spread his ashes in New Mexico, where he used to go to meditate. And I recommitted myself to that promise, but I didn't know how to do it. So on the plane home, I'm looking out the window like I'm going to see him on a cloud, floating by. And I just said, buddy, if you want me to get involved, send me a clue. And sure enough, as soon as I got off the plane, there was the Birmingham News Rack. The front page of the Sunday paper said, AIDS quilt comes to town, volunteers needed. So my entry into AIDS work was with the quilt. And that weekend, I volunteered for the first shift to unload and set things up. I never left the whole weekend. They literally had to kick me out at night. I also started volunteering with Birmingham AIDS Outreach, and I started their first buddy program. And through that experience, I learned a lot about caregiving. Even the medical community was afraid to touch patients. They were afraid to be around them. They would try and tell us that we had to put gowns on and gloves and all this stuff, and we weren't going to have any part of that. I had to have a whole crew of volunteers as late as 1997 in Fort Walton Beach to feed patients, because dietary would not even enter their room. They put the food outside. If they could get out of bed and get their food, they could eat. Otherwise, they didn't eat. So I had volunteers every day, every meal for like 2 years before they finally would agree to have dietary go into the room. That's the reason I actually wore my leather vest today, because in the early days of the epidemic, it was the leather community that stepped up first. We ignored and called BS on the doctors and nurses that said we couldn't hug our patients or our friends. The leather community, as well as our lesbian sisters, on the forefront. And hats off to the lesbians, because I'll be honest, gay men did not, prior to that, have any appreciation for lesbians. I used to go to bars and they had the lesbian corner, and and they were just excluded more or less from all the activities. But when they stepped forward, when nobody else would, yeah. A lot of my buddies were lesbians in my buddy program. They were the first to say, let me do this. They did it with heart, they did it with soul, they did it with precision. They were good at what they did. They trained themselves. They made sure they did everything right. And it changed the attitude of gay men towards lesbians. And there was a bond that was so close then. After that, no, everybody was on the same dance floor. It was happening in the South. It just wasn't getting any coverage. First of all, there was not any doctors that were educated well enough to even recognize the symptoms, to even think that they were seeing patients that had symptoms, but they didn't know what they were. So people were just dying mysteriously, you know. And of course, then stigma played a huge role in the South. It kept people from going to the doctor to get diagnosed after we were aware of what it might be, and they recognized the symptoms. You know, I list stigma as one of the opportunistic infections because I've seen it kill more people than pneumonia or anything else. I had more friends commit suicide because of stigma. We had no funeral home that would embalm a body. We had no preacher that would do a memorial service or a funeral. In Panama City for years, I did every celebration of life or memorial service for everybody that died from AIDS. And while we weren't New York or San Francisco, our population base, percentage-wise, our death rate was pretty high up there. I mean, one week I did 7 memorials, 3 in one day. There was a mother whose son had been kicked out when he graduated high school for being gay. He ended up in Atlanta. And years later, he contracted HIV and had dementia so bad, the police found him wandering the streets. At that time, he had become homeless. And in his wallet was his mother's address. And I was his case manager. And I was told by them that there were certain conditions if he was going to stay there. She said, because she was very religious, she said, you cannot stay in my house unless you agreed to be baptized. And he said, well, okay, Mother, I will agree if you agree to cremate me. And things went pretty good for a couple of months. And then the following February, we had a really cold February for Florida. And he had, at this time, he had toxoplasmosis, he had PCP pneumonia, he had CMV, he had thrush, and was in bed with a high fever. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, it dawned on her that he's gonna die. And he had not been baptized. She calls her minister, who comes out at 1 o'clock in the morning. They pick him up out of the bed with pneumonia, take him outside, baptized him in an unheated swimming pool, and he died 2 hours later. I said, you killed him. You know, she did not cremate him. She had a funeral. And she came up to me at the funeral and she says, do you think I'm a bad mother for not cremating him? I said, I not only think you're a bad mother, there's a special place in hell for mothers like you. And everybody was shocked because they'd never heard me even say that word. You know, they said, why are you talking to a grieving mother? I said, she's not grieving, she's celebrating. There was a conference in Bradenton, Florida called AIDS Minnesota. And that conference was for and by people living with HIV. And I used to attend that. And I met some of the most wonderful people, and a lot of them here from San Francisco. And Martin Delaney, who became my mentor for life, who started Project Inform out here. Marty is the one that had a big influence on my life as far as the education aspect. And he told me, he said, you're doing everything that you think is right, but I know you, and you're not an activist, you're an advocate. And there is a difference, and you need to know that difference. We need you to be the one talking to the representatives and the legislators who can make a difference and provide funding and services for people. And that's going to be your goal from now on. So, and because Marty was also HIV negative, and I was finding a hard time, I was dealing with trying to find my place in the community when I wasn't a part of the community. And Marty showed me that I was a part of the community. If you've walked this walk with anybody and you've lost that person, you're a part of that community and you have a role to play. In the 38 years I've been involved, the thing that stands out the most to me is what I learned about unconditional love. While I thought to myself, I'm there to help them, they help me. They're so caring about the effect their death's going to have on the people they care about. The times I sat there when I should have been the one with the last word saying, I love you, it was them saying, I love you, take care of yourself. So, unconditional love. And it keeps me going today. I'll be 77 in November, and keeping that promise, every day that promise is just as real. I made it in 88, and it still is real today to me, and I'm not going anywhere until I take my last breath and join my friends.